My name is Lucas Baines, and I'm 38 years old. This all happened in late September of last year, deep in the Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois, near a place called Garden of the Gods. I had come there for solitude, armed with a backpack full of supplies, my camera, and my loyal German Shepherd mix, Samson. I expected a peaceful escape from my life in the city, a week spent taking photos of the sandstone cliffs and enjoying the silence among the pines. I never could have imagined the terror waiting for me. I arrived on a crisp afternoon, the leaves just beginning to turn. The winding roads grew narrower the deeper I drove into the forest. By the time I pulled over at a dirt clearing, the nearest ranger station was miles away, and my phone signal flickered between one bar and none. It was exactly the kind of isolation I thought I needed. Samson was eager to stretch his legs, so I let him out, and he bounded around the clearing, sniffing at tree trunks and patches of tall grass. I set up a modest camp, a small tent, a tarp for my gear, and a simple fire ring. Sunset painted the sky in pink and orange streaks. I was pleased with myself for finding such a scenic spot. No other campers in sight. By nightfall, the only sounds came from crackling firewood and Samson's soft panting. The sense of peace was profound. That first night I woke suddenly to Samson growling. My watch read just after midnight. The growl rumbled low in his throat, unlike anything I'd heard from him before. A breeze rustled the pines and I caught a faint howl carried on the wind, long, guttural, and nothing like a wolf. It raised the hairs on my neck. I told myself it was probably just a coyote or some stray animal. Still, I stoked the fire to chase away the darkness, keeping a wary eye on the tree line. Morning arrived without further incident, though I discovered massive, strange tracks about 30 yards from my tent. They were elongated, with claw marks at the end of each toe. I tried rationalizing that these must have been a large dog's or maybe a bear's, despite never having seen such odd footprints before. Samson sniffed them, but backed away with a whimper. Something about them unsettled him. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Later that day, I decided to hike toward the Garden of the Gods area with Samson trotting at my side. I was in the midst of framing a shot of the unique sandstone formations when a man's voice startled me. I spun to see a tall, lanky figure in worn boots and hunting gear. He introduced himself as Russell Gaines. He had a friendly enough demeanor, maybe a bit rough around the edges. "Didn't mean to scare you," Russell said, pushing up the brim of his faded cap. "I was hunting nearby and noticed you were alone out here. Name's Russell." "Lucas," I replied, reaching out to shake his hand. "And this is Samson." Russell gave Samson a cautious pat. "Beautiful dog. Just be careful camping too far off the main trails. These woods can get dangerous." He wouldn't elaborate on what exactly made them dangerous. Instead, he warned me that folks sometimes went missing out here or got injured exploring areas they shouldn't. Then he casually mentioned he had a small hunting cabin nearby, along with 2 friends, Carter and Joni, who were on an extended hunting trip. He invited me to drop by that evening for dinner. I was hesitant but also curious. The thought of company, even for one night, appealed to me. The memory of those strange footprints lingered in my mind, and a part of me wanted safety in numbers. I followed Russell along a narrow game trail that wound through dense pines and rocky outcroppings. He pointed out certain plants and mentioned local legends, but he didn't say much about himself. He walked quickly, not showing the slightest uncertainty about where he was going. Samson stayed close, occasionally pricking up his ears at distant rustling sounds. Eventually, we reached a clearing where a rough-hewn cabin stood, more of a shack than a proper home. Sheets of corrugated metal had been patched along the sides, and empty beer cans littered the porch. Two people were outside. A burly man with a shotgun resting against his hip and a lean woman cleaning what looked like traps. "Got us a visitor," Russell called, motioning me forward. "This here is Lucas, and that's his dog." The burly man squinted at me. "Name's Carter," he said with a curt nod. "We don't usually see many folks out this far." The woman set down a metal trap and wiped her hands on her jeans. "Joni, did Russell convince you to join us for dinner?" I nodded, feeling a little uneasy but determined to stay polite. "He did." They said they'd been hunting deer, though I didn't see any fresh kills or deer carcasses. The cabin's interior was cramped, smelling of stale cigarettes. Carter offered me a seat at a rickety table. Russell opened a few tins of beans and some venison jerky. Joni watched me closely with sharp, curious eyes, asking how long I'd been camping, how far from the main road my car was, and whether anyone else knew where I was. Something in her tone felt off. She laughed it off as friendly conversation, but I sensed an undercurrent of interrogation. Samson stayed near the door, occasionally growling quietly. Through one grimy window, I watched the sun dip below the treetops. A chilly wind rattled the loose boards on the porch. Russell told me I was welcome to crash there for the night, but I politely declined, deciding I preferred my tent after all. Still, the invitation made me grateful. Maybe these were just rough-around-the-edges hunters trying to be neighborly. Then, in the distance, I heard it again. That same haunting howl from the previous night, echoing somewhere beyond the cabin. Samson stood up, ears perked, a low growl in his throat. Carter muttered a curse and grabbed his shotgun, slamming shut the window shutters. Joni exhaled, shaking her head. "It's back again," she whispered. Russell caught my eye. "We've heard it too. Thought maybe it was a sick coyote, but it doesn't sound natural, does it?" Something clawed at the outer walls of the cabin then. A scrape that raised goosebumps all over my arms. My heart pounded in my chest. Carter flipped off the overhead light and aimed his shotgun at the door. In the darkness, I could see the whites of everyone's eyes. Samson's growl intensified. Another howl shattered the silence, this one much closer, rattling the very boards of the shack. Carter fired a shot through the glass of a window, the flash lighting the room for an instant. Then everything went still. No more howls, no more scratching. Only the frantic thump of my pulse in my ears. We waited in tense silence for several minutes, guns pointed at every shadow. Finally, Russell unbarred the door and peered outside with a flashlight. Deep claw marks ran across the wall. The wood was shredded. I noticed a foul, almost rotting stench wafting in through the broken window. No one spoke for a long while. "It's gone," Russell finally said, stepping back in, "for now." Everyone's nerves were frayed. Carter kept muttering that he'd kill that thing the next time it showed up. Joni looked from me to Samson, biting her lip. I thought it might be best for me to leave, but something in their eyes told me that might not be so simple. Tension had crept into the air like a cold draft. "I should head back to my campsite," I said, trying to sound casual. "I appreciate the dinner." Russell blocked the doorway, shaking his head. "Lucas, that'd be a bad idea. It's almost full dark. If that thing's out there, you won't make it 10 minutes on your own." I looked at Samson, who was still growling quietly. A voice in my head told me to run anyway, to trust my instincts. But it was already dark, and something monstrous was lurking out there. Reluctantly, I agreed to stay until morning. Carter grunted and nodded toward a small storage room in the back. "You can set up in there or sleep on the couch. Up to you." I decided on the storage room, wanting a bit of privacy. It smelled like mildew and old boots. I set down my backpack and patted Samson's head, whispering that we'd leave at dawn. Exhaustion tugged at me, but sleep came fitfully. Every time I drifted off, I imagined that howl, those claws raking against the cabin wall. Several hours later, I jerked awake to find someone shining a flashlight in my face. It was Joni. She pressed a finger to her lips. "Don't freak out. Russell wants to talk, quietly." My heart hammered. Why would he need to talk privately in the middle of the night? I followed her, with Samson right behind me. She led me back to the main room, where Russell and Carter stood whispering. The air was thick with tension. My gut screamed that something was very wrong. Russell looked at Carter, then at me. "We need to make sure we're all on the same page about what you've seen tonight, Lucas." I frowned. "The same page about what?" "How far out is your car again?" Carter asked, voice low. Something about the question felt like a threat. "A ways back. I left it on a dirt path near an old sign for Garden of the Gods," I said vaguely. "And you know, I've got folks who expect me back soon." I lied. In truth, no one expected me for days. I hoped that bluff might keep them from trying anything. Samson sensed my fear. His ears flattened, and he let out a short bark. Russell sighed. "We've got a situation here, Lucas. We can't risk you going into town and talking about us." My mouth went dry. "Why not?" Carter smirked. "We saw your fancy camera gear. Maybe you stumbled onto something you shouldn't have. Maybe you'll run your mouth and cause trouble." I realized they must have some illegal operation in these woods. Suddenly, the tension made sense. They didn't trust me. Maybe they were making drugs, poaching, or hiding contraband. Whatever it was, they decided I wasn't leaving. I backed away, putting a hand on Samson's collar. "I'm not looking for trouble." Carter lunged, cracking me across the jaw with the butt of his shotgun. Pain exploded in my head, and I collapsed to the floor, ears ringing. Samson barked in fury and lunged at him, but Joni kicked the dog hard. Samson yelped and scrambled to regain his footing. Before I could stand, Russell pinned my arms behind my back. I fought, but Carter hit me again, and my vision tunneled. I heard Samson barking, growling, then a shot fired. Darkness closed in before I could see what happened to my dog. I awoke in a filthy cellar or storage hole, my head pounding, hands tied behind my back. My mouth tasted blood. The only light came from a single dim bulb overhead. An old metal door blocked the exit. Despite my throbbing skull, my first thought was of Samson. I couldn't see or hear him anywhere. After what felt like hours, the door swung open. Russell entered holding a pistol. Carter and Joni stood behind him, both armed. I pushed myself up, wrists raw against the rope. "You're going to answer some questions," Russell said calmly. "Then we'll figure out what to do with you." Carter took a menacing step forward, starting with who else knows you're here. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "My coworkers," I lied. "They know my schedule. If I don't check in soon, they'll come looking." Russell just stared at me, unconvinced. "Listen, you were curious about those noises you heard in these woods, right? That howling? We've heard it for days. It's driving off our game. We've lost good money. So we're not letting you go until we're sure you're not a problem. Get me?" I blinked, trying to piece together how to survive this. "What did you do with Samson?" Carter shrugged. "He ran off after I grazed him with a bullet. Could still be out there, or maybe that thing got him by now. Dogs don't last long if it catches their scent." My stomach twisted. The image of Samson alone in the forest, wounded, tore at me. I closed my eyes, thinking of how many times he'd protected me. Now, he was out there, maybe dying. Joni knelt next to me, a vicious glint in her eyes. We can make this easy, or we can make it real hard. Which will it be? Before I could speak, a distant scream echoed through the cabin. It cut through our confrontation like a knife. Carter and Russell exchanged alarmed looks. "Stay here," Russell ordered Joni. Then he and Carter dashed out. Joni hesitated, glancing from me to the door. Another scream ripped the night, louder, then abruptly ended. It was a man's voice. I realized with a surge of hope, maybe the creature was back, attacking them. Suddenly, we heard a series of gunshots above us. Joni whirled around, panic flashing across her face. That was my chance. Despite my hands bound behind me, I charged her, slamming my shoulder into her side. She staggered and fell onto the floor. I scrambled toward the open door, adrenaline flooding my veins. Joni grabbed my ankle, but I kicked her, ignoring the pain in my wrists. I forced myself upright and stumbled out of the cellar, nearly tripping on the steps. The cabin's main floor was in chaos. The front door stood wide open, letting in cold air that reeked of decay. I heard Carter yelling, followed by a guttural roar that sounded inhuman. I raced down the hall, glimpsing the living room through a broken window. The creature stood half in shadow, half in moonlight. An emaciated figure with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed faintly. Carter fired his shotgun blindly. The blast shattered another window, but the monster lunged impossibly fast. Carter's scream ended in a wet gurgle as the creature dragged him outside. Something scrambled behind me. Joni giving chase. I spotted a battered hunting knife lying on a table, likely dropped in the chaos. I twisted, grabbing it in my bound hands just as Joni lunged. She crashed into me, knocking us both to the floor. The knife clattered out of reach for a moment. Then we both saw it simultaneously. We struggled, rolling across the floor in a violent scuffle. I managed to elbow her in the face and she fell back, dazed. I brought my hands down on the handle of the knife, slicing through the rope. My wrists burned, but I was free. I scooped up the knife, turned on Joni, and in a trembling voice shouted, "Don't move!" She stared at me, hatred mixing with fear. "We were just protecting ourselves," she hissed. "You should have stayed out of this." I heard a crash from the front porch. A second later, Russell stumbled into the living room, slamming the door behind him. His shirt was torn and bloody. He locked eyes with me, then looked at Joni, the knife in my hand, and the ropes on the floor. He let out a furious shout and raised his pistol. But before he could pull the trigger, the window behind him exploded inward. A clawed hand shot through and caught Russell by the shoulder, yanking him back. He screamed, dropping the gun. His eyes went wide in raw terror as the creature's jaws clamped onto his neck. Blood splattered the floor. Joni leapt to her feet and ran past me out through the back door. She didn't look back. My heart hammered as I snatched the pistol Russell had dropped. The wind outside howled, or maybe it was the monster. I didn't want to stay to find out. I sprinted out the back of the cabin, pausing to see if Samson might be there. I whistled once, quietly, praying to see him emerge. Nothing. Fear and grief clawed at me, but I forced myself to keep moving. I ran blindly through the trees, branches scratching my face and arms. The moonlight filtered in patches through the canopy. Behind me, I heard a faint shriek, a mix of rage and hunger. The thought of that thing pursuing me pushed me onward, ignoring the dull throbbing in my head. At some point, I tripped over a fallen log and crashed onto my side. The pain ripped the breath from my lungs, but as I lay there, I heard a dog whimper close by. My heart soared. "Samson," I called, voice shaking. He limped out of the darkness, tail wagging feebly, ears back. A small graze marred his fur on his side, but he was alive. Relief swamped me. I carefully patted him, checking for any serious wounds. He nuzzled my hand, letting out a soft whine. We had to keep going. I rose unsteadily, pistol still in my grip. Samson limped alongside me as we pressed deeper into the forest. My only chance was to find the dirt road that led back to my truck. Every snapping twig made my pulse jump. I stopped listening to the wind. I listened for that scraping, howling presence that had attacked the cabin, for the sound of pursuit from Joni if she was still alive out here. We navigated by moonlight, turning every few minutes to see if we were being followed. Dawn was a faint suggestion on the horizon by the time we stumbled upon the dirt road. The truck was still there, partially obscured by branches. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get the doors open. Samson hopped onto the passenger seat, breathing heavily. My hands trembled so violently I almost dropped the key. Finally, the ignition turned over, and the engine roared to life. I sped off, not bothering to look behind me. I drove until I found a paved road and a weak phone signal. I called the local sheriff's office, ranting about a monster, missing people, a destroyed cabin. My words came out fractured by panic. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to check, but their tone carried a wary disbelief. They asked me to calm down and wait for authorities. Instead, I kept driving until I reached the nearest town, not stopping until I was in the parking lot of a small grocery store, where a crowd of normal, everyday people made me feel safe for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The sheriff eventually arrived there, took my statement, and examined the cut rope marks on my wrists and the blood-stained clothing. They asked about the creature, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes when I mentioned it. They were more interested in hearing about Russell, Carter, and Joni, about possible criminal activity, drug trafficking, or kidnapping. When they questioned me about the criminal's location, I told them as best I could, though I couldn't remember the exact directions in the dark. I had no idea if the authorities ever found what remained of that cabin or the people in it. The official record might claim some accident, a wild animal attack, but I know better. I never went back to that part of Shawnee National Forest. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that haunting howl echoing in my dreams. My wrists, scarred from the ropes, occasionally ache in cold weather, a lingering reminder of my captivity. And Samson, my loyal companion, has never fully recovered from the limp in his back leg. But we're alive, and for that, I'm grateful. I often think about how close I came to dying in those woods. Part of me can't decide which was the real monster, the gaunt, ravenous creature that tore Russell apart, or the criminals who tried to ensure I wouldn't leave alive. Maybe fear, desperation, and isolation turned us all into something less than human that night. All I know for certain is that something lurks out there among the pines, hungry and patient. And if you ever find yourself alone in the heart of the Shawnee National Forest, you'd better pray that you only run into the local wildlife, because not everything in those woods is just an animal. Some things are far, far worse. My name is Aaron Collins, and I'm 32 years old. This happened late last autumn when I took my renovated RV to a remote campground near the Kaskaskia River in southern Illinois. I was a freelance travel writer on the hunt for peaceful, lesser-known spots to feature in my next article. At the time, I figured I'd snap a few photos, jot down some scenic descriptions, and enjoy a quiet week on my own. What I found instead nearly cost me my life. I arrived at the Kaskaskia River campground on a gray afternoon. The trees along the river were turning russet and gold, the breeze carrying a faint chill. A handwritten sign at the entrance read Maddox Campground, and beyond it stretched a row of dusty RV pads nestled under tall oaks. Only 3 of them were occupied. 2 looked like permanent residents, judging by the clutter of furniture and old grills. The last pad sat empty, waiting for me. An older couple, Henry and Pearl Maddox, greeted me from a small wooden office cabin. Henry was stocky with thinning gray hair, while Pearl was petite. her kindly face etched with lines of age. Their warm smiles seemed genuine enough. Henry gave me a map of the grounds, instructions about hooking up the water and electricity, and then paused. "You'll like it here, Miss Collins," he said, clearing his throat. "It's quiet. You just don't want to go wandering too far. The riverbank can get dangerous after dark." Pearl's eyes flicked to her husband, then back to me. "Yes, dear. Best to stay near the main trails." I found their warning a little odd. Most campground hosts warn about raccoons or slippery trails, not the riverbank can get dangerous. But I shrugged it off, assuming they worried about the flash floods or local wildlife. I parked my RV in a spot that offered a decent view of the water, half hidden behind a stand of trees. It felt private, a place I could finally relax. That evening, I drove a few miles to a tiny general store run by a man named Russell "Rusty" Clemens. The shelves held a mishmash of groceries, fishing gear, and local souvenirs. A single overhead bulb buzzed as I approached the counter. "New in town?" Rusty asked. He was wiry, in his late 50s, and he kept darting glances out the window. "I'm staying at the Maddox's campground," I said, "working on a travel piece. Heard this area was a hidden gem." He forced a tight smile. "Hidden it is. Not many folks come by anymore." His tone sounded cautious, like he wasn't sure if he should say more. Then he quietly added, "Stick to the main roads after dark. Folks been spooked lately. Some trouble near the river." I tried to get him to elaborate, but he just mumbled something about being careful and turned to help another customer. The interaction left me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Driving back to the RV, I reminded myself that small towns often have local legends, ghost stories, or cryptic warnings that rarely amount to anything more than folklore. My first night at the campground was uneventful. After setting up, I flipped through some old guidebooks, hoping to find any mention of local points of interest. Eventually, fatigue set in. I turned off the lights and curled up in my small bed. Sometime after midnight, I startled awake. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. Then I heard it, a faint, whispery voice outside the RV. It was impossible to make out words, more like a hushed humming carried by the breeze. My skin prickled. Grabbing a flashlight, I peered out the window into the darkness. Fog clung to the ground, and the oak branches swayed, but I saw no one. No footsteps. No other RV lights. Silence. The next morning, I discovered muddy footprints near the RV's door. They were small, almost like a child's footprints, but the shape seemed wrong. The toes were elongated, the impressions slightly off balance. A shiver ran up my spine. I snapped a photo of them and decided I'd ask Henry or Pearl if they knew about stray animals, or if some local kids were pranking campers. Before I could do that, I felt a need to learn more about the area. So I drove toward the nearest town, about 10 miles away, and visited a little library that looked like it had been built in the 1920s. The place was dimly lit, with a musty smell and walls lined with dusty books. I introduced myself to the librarian, an elderly man who seemed half asleep behind the desk, and asked if they had any historical records on the region. He guided me to a cramped back room housing local archives. After sifting through old newspaper clippings and ledgers, I discovered references to an 1800s settlement near the Kaskaskia River. The settlers had accused a woman of witchcraft. Her name was lost, only referred to as the Hag of the Kaskaskia. One yellowed article described how villagers had drowned her in the river for practicing dark enchantments. Another piece hinted at sightings of a ghostly woman haunting the riverbanks, especially during the fall months. The repeated mention of vanished travelers caught my attention. Locals whispered that the drowned witch roamed the water's edge, luring wanderers with unearthly whispers. As a travel writer, I'd come across plenty of folklore, but something about this made me uneasy. Maybe the footprints from last night, or the unsettled look on Rusty's face. I decided to head back to the campground and talk to Henry and Pearl, see if there was any truth to these stories. When I arrived, Pearl was outside watering a row of wilting flowers. She listened politely as I asked her about local tales. She exchanged a glance with Henry, who had stepped out of their office. "It's just old stories," she said softly. "People spook themselves over any little noise in these parts." Henry frowned. "Though it's true, folks have gone missing," he added in a low voice. "A fisherman last spring. Another traveler the summer before that. Some say the witch drags them into the water." Pearl's lips thinned. "Stop it, Henry. You'll scare her off." Henry shrugged. "She has a right to know. We don't want any more trouble." I tried pressing them for details, but they retreated behind vague warnings to stay near the campground at night. They offered no explanations for the footprints or the whispered voice. Unsatisfied, I returned to my RV, the entire conversation replaying in my head. That evening, I decided to do a little exploring myself. Just a short walk toward the river. I told myself I was being practical, investigating a possible story angle. In truth, my curiosity had shifted to genuine concern. I wanted to see if there was any sign of something unnatural. The sun was setting as I made my way down a narrow path lined with cattails. The rush of the Kaskaskia's waters grew louder. I began noticing an odd hush in the air. Crickets and frogs that had been singing just moments ago went silent. Then I heard it again, a faint, sing-song whisper. My pulse quickened. I aimed my flashlight along the riverbank. Shadows flickered across the reeds. When I moved closer, I caught a glimpse of a figure among the fog. It appeared hunched, with long strands of dark hair obscuring its face. Then it vanished behind a stand of trees. My heart hammered. I raced over, flashlight bouncing off tree trunks, but I found nothing. No person, no footprints aside from a few partial indentations in the mud. A chill settled in my bones. I retreated to my RV, locking every door and window. That night, I slept little, half expecting to hear that whisper return. Morning came quietly, but dread lingered like an ache in my muscles. Deciding it might calm my nerves to talk to someone in authority, I drove over to the local police station, a modest brick building at the edge of town. There, I met Deputy Marcia Dale, a tall woman with short-cropped hair and a stoic demeanor. She listened to my story, tapping a pen on her desk with barely concealed impatience. "I appreciate your concern, Miss Collins," she said when I finished. "But the river's big. People get lost, accidents happen. As for spooky sightings, these forests can play tricks on you, especially with the fog." Her gaze, however, seemed to betray more knowledge than she let on. I pressed her. "What about the missing fisherman last spring? Or the traveler before that? It's more than just accidents, isn't it?" She stiffened. "Those cases are still open. No evidence of foul play. We don't have the resources to chase every rumor." I left feeling brushed off and decided to return to Rusty's store. If the deputy wouldn't talk, maybe the store owner would. But Rusty only repeated the same warnings about being careful at night. He grew fidgety, eventually muttering, "We have our own ways of keeping everyone safe, you hear? Best if you mind your business." That sense of secrecy made my skin crawl. It felt like the entire area harbored a hidden dread. I found myself driving back to the campground with a stomach twisted into knots. My RV was the only place that felt remotely secure. By the time I pulled in, dusk was creeping over the treetops. Pearl and Henry were nowhere in sight, and the lights in their office cabin were dim. As I approached my RV, my heart sank. The back tires were both flat. At first, I thought I must have run over nails or broken glass. Then I saw they'd been slashed, clean cuts across the rubber. My mind raced. Who would do this? And why? A flicker of movement caught my eye near a clump of bushes behind the office cabin. Something rustled the branches. I shouted, demanding to know who was there, but only silence replied. My flashlight illuminated a path of flattened grass leading into the woods. Anxiety flared. If I was being targeted, I needed help. But the office was locked, and neither Henry nor Pearl answered my frantic knocks. With night falling, there was no option to drive to town on 2 shredded tires. I retreated to my RV, determined to call for a tow or the sheriff, but my phone could only manage 1 weak bar of signal. The call to dispatch dropped twice, and even when it rang through, the deputy on the line said the earliest they could come was morning. They had an urgent matter elsewhere. Anger warred with fear. I locked myself inside, triple-checking every window. My only company was the flicker of the overhead lamp and the low hum of the RV's furnace. The hours dragged. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Through a gap in the curtains, I spotted flashlights bobbing in the dark. I strained to see who held them. Then I made out Henry's voice, followed by Pearl. They sounded terrified, whispering in hushed tones. "She's the one," Pearl said. "We can't lose another neighbor. The witch demands another offering. You know that." My blood turned to ice. Offering? Witch demands? The words circled in my mind, impossible to accept. Henry spoke next, sounding pained. "I hate this, but you saw what happened last time. The nightmares, the missing folks. It's real. If we don't act, the witch will come for us." My stomach lurched with realization. They intended to use me as some sort of sacrifice. The sabotage to my RV, the deputy's dismissal, Rusty's cryptic warnings. They were all part of this twisted plan, or at least a result of their shared fear. My hands shook as I reached for the keys, thinking I could at least start the RV engine. But with 2 flat tires, I'd never escape that way. Suddenly, a loud pounding came on my RV door. I scrambled to the cockpit, hoping I could still drive a short distance on the rims. The engine coughed to life, but the vehicle refused to budge, tires scraping and screeching on the gravel. The banging grew more frantic. Through the front windshield, I saw flashlights shining directly into my eyes. "Aaron, come out," Pearl shouted, voice trembling. "We don't want to hurt you, but we can't let that thing take us all." I locked the doors, refusing to comply. Then a side window shattered. Shards of glass rained down on the passenger seat. Henry reached in, fumbling for the lock, while Pearl tried to pry open the door. Panicking, I grabbed the only weapon I had, a small wrench from my RV toolkit, and swung it at Henry's hand. He yelped, pulling back. The engine sputtered uselessly as I tried pressing the gas again. With a metal screech, the front tire rims ground deeper into the gravel. I wasn't going anywhere. Another window shattered behind me. Pearl managed to unlock the door from the inside. They burst in, flashlights illuminating the cramped interior. I fought back, adrenaline surging, but Henry wrested the wrench away, and Pearl pinned my arm. "We're sorry," Pearl muttered, tears glistening in her eyes. "We don't have a choice." I screamed, thrashing, but they overpowered me. They bound my wrists with plastic ties, then dragged me outside. The night air bit at my skin. My heart hammered as they led me through the trees, deeper into the darkness. Other figures joined us, ghostly shapes in the faint moonlight. I recognized Rusty, eyes filled with regret, and even Deputy Dale, whose face was set with grim determination. They marched me down the trail toward the river, which shimmered silver under the moon. Fog drifted above the surface, giving the scene an otherworldly, menacing look. A small clearing opened by the water's edge, reeds rustling softly. I could hear my own ragged breaths and the quiet sobs of someone in the group. Rusty took out a battered flashlight, revealing a half-circle of stones arranged in a crude altar. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These people truly believed they had to sacrifice me to this alleged witch? Deputy Dale stepped forward, speaking in a low, shaky voice. "We do this for the good of all," she said. "Please, Miss Collins, just don't fight." I glared at her, heart pounding. "You can't do this," I shouted. "You're crazy. You—" A strangled cry escaped my throat as Henry pushed me to my knees in front of the stone ring. Everything grew silent for a moment, as if the river itself paused to witness the horror unfolding. Then the wind picked up, carrying a chilling voice that seemed to swirl around us all. It was the same whisper I'd heard outside my RV, only this time it was louder, more insistent, like a deathly lullaby. Several of the townsfolk clutched one another, eyes darting around in panic. From the blackness of the riverbank, a hunched figure materialized. The form wore dripping, ragged garments, impossible to tell if it was cloth or clumps of moss. Long strings of dark hair hung over a gaunt, pale face. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. The witch. She let out a raspy, keening moan that cut through the night like shards of glass. Pearl screamed and stumbled back. Rusty stared in horror. The group seemed frozen, caught between terror and the grim resolve that had led them here. I couldn't stop shaking, but I managed to twist my wrists against the plastic ties. I felt them loosen. Maybe the frantic struggle had worn them down. The witch advanced with unnatural speed. In one fluid motion, she seized Henry by the arm. He let out a blood-curdling scream as she dragged him into the swirling fog by the water, her bony fingers wrapping around his chest. Pearl collapsed, sobbing Henry's name. The rest scattered, shining flashlights wildly. Deputy Dale tried to fire her pistol, but the shot went wide, echoing across the river. Then the witch disappeared into the thick haze, Henry's screams echoing and then choking off. Chaos erupted. Rusty dropped his flashlight and bolted. Pearl remained on the ground, eyes glazed with shock. Deputy Dale took a few shaky steps toward the water, shining her flashlight. I used the distraction to free my wrists, the plastic finally giving way with a sharp snap. My hands burned, but relief flooded through me. I stumbled to my feet, ignoring the throbbing in my arms. The witch's raspy whisper filled the clearing again, accompanied by a damp rattling sound, like bones scraping on rocks. The pungent smell of river mud assaulted my nose. In that instant, I saw the silhouette of the witch re-emerge from the fog. She clutched something limp in her grasp, Henry's body. A ragged gasp escaped me. The creature tossed Henry aside with unnatural strength, then turned her glowing eyes on Deputy Dale. Dale fired again, but the witch was too quick, darting behind tall reeds. In a flash, the deputy was slammed to the ground by a clawed hand. Her scream snapped me into motion. Blood pounded in my ears, survival instincts flaring. I sprinted away from the stones, away from the water. Trees whipped past me, branches scratching my face. Fog hugged the ground, making every step a risk. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. I had to get back to my RV, though I knew it was immobilized. Maybe I could find my phone, call for help from a better vantage point. Behind me, I heard shrieking. I couldn't tell whose voice it was. The entire town must have been in panic by now. Stumbling onto the main dirt path, I nearly collided with a battered pickup truck sitting with its engine running. Rusty was inside, fiddling with the gear shift. He spotted me, eyes wide. "Get away," he shouted. I can't let you." Before he could finish, I yanked the passenger door open and scrambled in, desperate. He jerked the wheel, trying to shake me off, but I grabbed at him, forcing him to keep the truck steady. "Drive!" I begged, tears streaming down my cheeks. "We'll both die if we stay." He hesitated, torn between fear and guilt. Then the final scream from the river reached our ears, making his decision for him. He slammed the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, headlights illuminating the twisting trees. We tore out of the campground, skidding onto the narrow country road that led to the highway. Rusty's hands trembled on the wheel. "You don't understand," he whispered. "Without a sacrifice, the witch will come for all of us." I didn't respond. Nothing could justify what they'd tried to do. I pressed my palm against the seat, trying to steady myself. My body shook with aftershocks of terror. We rode in stunned silence until the road curved, and the flicker of streetlights appeared in the distance. The small town still slept, ignorant of the horrors by the river. When Rusty slowed near the outskirts, I opened the door and jumped out, nearly stumbling on the pavement. He didn't try to stop me. The pickup sped away, taillights disappearing around a bend. Maybe he feared I'd turn him in, or maybe he just wanted to save himself. I limped into a 24-hour gas station, clothes torn and muddy. The clerk gave me a startled look, but I went straight for the phone, ignoring his questions. I dialed the local sheriff's number. My voice shook as I told them there had been multiple attacks, that people were dead or missing at the Maddox's campground. The dispatcher tried to calm me, telling me to wait there. By dawn, I'd repeated my story to uniformed officers from a neighboring county because Deputy Dale was nowhere to be found. They took photos of my injuries, my wrists raw from the plastic ties. I guided them back to the campground, though I was terrified the witch might still be lurking. What we found was unsettling but inconclusive. Trampled ground, signs of a struggle, spatters of blood near the riverbank. But no bodies, no Henry, no Pearl, no sign of the others. It was as if the mist had swallowed them all. The official report chalked the disappearances up to an unknown incident. When I mentioned the witch, I saw the same skeptical looks I'd gotten before. They spoke to me kindly, but I knew they didn't believe in any centuries-old spirit, only that I'd narrowly escaped a violent group of locals. Yet, not a single one of those townspeople turned up afterward. Rusty's store was shuttered, the Maddox's office locked. The place became a ghost town overnight. I left southern Illinois the next day, hobbling on a sprained ankle, my RV towed to the nearest mechanic for new tires. I stayed in a cheap motel, eyes darting at every passing shadow. Even once I was out of the state, I couldn't shake the memory of that whisper at night, the glow of those eyes by the river. Eventually, I wrote a piece about haunted river legends, but I kept the darkest details to myself. Some horrors are too real, too raw, to share with curious readers searching for a weekend getaway. Now, months later, I still can't sleep if I hear water running at night. I've read scattered news bits about more missing persons along the Kaskaskia River. The articles never offer closure. Maybe the witch claimed another victim. Maybe the townsfolk reappeared somewhere else, continuing their twisted ritual. I don't know. All I do know is that I survived, and I'll never forget the hush of the river, the moonlit clearing, and the hush-voiced thing that prowled those banks, hungry for another soul. My name is Mark Coleman, and I'm 44 years old. This happened earlier this spring, when I parked my RV at a quiet campsite near Jim Edgar Panther Creek State, fish and wildlife area in central Illinois. I had driven hundreds of miles looking for a serene place to work on my handmade furniture, which I sell at craft fairs. I'd recently gone through a rough divorce and needed the solace of nature to clear my head and refocus on my craft. I had no idea that in those peaceful woodlands, something would test my very sense of self. I pulled into the campground late in the afternoon. The trees were bursting with fresh leaves and patches of prairie grass stretched out beyond them. The sign over the entrance read Panther Creek Campground, host Marjorie Rains. There were only a few RVs scattered around, so I easily found a spot near a small stand of trees, close enough to an electrical hookup for my workshop tools. As I stepped out to survey the site, a woman in her 50s with short, wavy hair approached me. She wore a green windbreaker and carried a clipboard. "Welcome," she said. "I'm Marjorie, the campground host. Need help checking in?" "Sure thing," I replied. "I'm Mark Coleman." She jotted down my name and license plate number. "I'll set you up for however many nights you want, Mark. Just so you know, we've had some, odd break-ins around here at night. Keep your doors locked and your valuables secured, okay?" "Break-ins?" I frowned. Is it people or wildlife getting into places? She hesitated. "No one's sure. Some folks claim they're seeing large footprints, others say it might be a prank. Just stay alert." I thanked her for the tip and watched her walk back toward a small cabin that served as an office. Locking my RV at night wasn't new to me, but her warning left a curious note in my mind. After hooking up to power, I unpacked the wood planks and carving tools I'd brought along. The plan was to shape a few table legs and maybe photograph them against the lush, natural backdrop. Evening settled quickly, the sky tinted pink and orange, and I realized I was more tired than I'd thought. So I locked up and climbed into my RV, preparing to make dinner and then turn in. A couple of hours later, I lay in bed with the lights off, listening to the wind rustle the nearby branches. Then I heard footsteps, or what sounded like footsteps, on the gravel outside. I froze, straining to see through the window, but in the dark I couldn't make out much. My first instinct was to assume an animal was sniffing around, but something felt off. The steps seemed too regular, pausing every few seconds like someone was circling my RV. Heart pounding, I reminded myself that random campers might pass by on a late-night walk. Eventually, the sound faded, and I managed to fall asleep, though a sense of unease gnawed at me. The next morning, I found scratch marks along the lower edge of my RV door. Thin, jagged lines, as if made by a large blade or thick claws. Raccoons, maybe? But it was too precise for an animal rummaging for food. I cleaned the marks with a rag, refusing to let paranoia ruin my day. Then I set up my portable workbench outside, turned on a local radio station, and started carving table legs. The rhythmic scrape of the chisel steadied my nerves. That afternoon, a teenage boy strolled by, stopping to admire my work. He introduced himself as Josh Jordan, though he preferred JJ. He wore battered sneakers, cargo pants, and a t-shirt bearing a stylized fish logo. "I live nearby," he said, leaning against a tree. "I mostly come out here to fish or hunt. You staying a while?" "I'm here for a few days at least," I replied, grateful for friendly conversation. Just me, my tools, and the quiet. Some weird stuff happened last night, though. Scratches on my door. JJ nodded, crossing his arms. "Marjorie's probably told you. People say something's prowling around. There's an old legend about a shapeshifter in these woods, like a skinwalker or doppelganger. I'm not sure I believe it, but folks claim it can take human form. Scares them enough that some pack up and leave early." I snorted softly, not wanting to encourage tall tales. "I'm guessing it's a person messing around. Maybe thieves." JJ shrugged. "Could be. One rumor says if you see it, it'll start imitating your voice, your face, sometimes even your clothes. There's a bit in local lore about it not having a proper reflection in water or mirrors." He smirked at my skeptical expression. "Just be careful, okay?" I gave him a friendly nod, and he wandered off. Despite myself, I couldn't shake a creeping chill. That night, I made sure to secure every latch on the RV, even double-checking the windows. Then I settled into bed, reading a book about woodworking techniques. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps or scraping outside. I gripped a flashlight and tiptoed to a window. Through the curtains, I glimpsed a faint silhouette. It vanished into the shadows before I could identify it. I considered going out there, but caution won out. Instead, I flicked on the RV's outdoor floodlight. The bright beam revealed empty gravel and a few moths spiraling in the light. No sign of an intruder. But when I woke at dawn, fresh scratch marks marred the back of my RV near the water hookup. They formed a strange symbol, almost symmetrical. My heart lurched at the thought that this might be deliberate. I reported it to the local park ranger, a man named Officer Dan Whitaker. He was in his mid-30s, tall, and looked like he was juggling a dozen problems at once. He took a few notes, frowned at the markings, and said, "I'll log this. Probably just some kids playing a prank. We get that every season." His dismissive tone annoyed me, but I thanked him anyway. The following day, tensions rose. I left the RV for a short walk, hoping to snap pictures of the forest for my online listings. When I returned, I found my door slightly ajar. Inside, the place looked mostly undisturbed, but my phone was missing from where I'd left it charging. I spent an hour searching, convinced I'd misplaced it, but it wasn't there. Frustrated, I locked up and headed out to find Ranger Whitaker again. Before I made it far, JJ hailed me from the side of the road, brandishing something in his hand. My phone. "Found it at the edge of the campground," he said, eyes wide. "I saw it light up, came over and, well, it looks like yours, right?" I grabbed it, relief and confusion swirling in my head. "Yeah, it's mine. Wait, who took it outside?" JJ hesitated. "It was on the ground near the big oak tree. I checked the gallery. Sorry, I know that's invasive. But there were these creepy pictures." His words made my heart pound. I opened the gallery. Sure enough, new photos I hadn't taken appeared, most out of focus. A few were black frames with a faint reflection of my own face? No, the angles were wrong, and the lighting made the face look twisted, stretched. Another shot showed me asleep in my bed from the night before. My stomach clenched as I realized someone, or something, had been in my RV at night, photographing me without my knowledge. Feeling violated and furious, I took the photos to Whitaker. He looked more concerned this time, but still tried to keep calm. "We'll patrol the area more, keep an eye out. This could be a trespasser, maybe a drifter messing with campers. I doubt it's anything supernatural." He offered a forced smile. "You'll be all right." A knot of anger and fear settled in my chest. I felt certain the culprit was someone close, maybe even a fellow camper or staff member, but I couldn't accuse anyone without proof. That evening, I spoke to Marjorie again. She lowered her voice as we stood by the office cabin, the sun setting behind us. "Mark, I'm telling you, weird things happen here," she said. "Stories go way back. Some say it's an old spirit that prowls at night, taking forms. I know it sounds crazy, but I've lived in this area most of my life, and I've seen enough to keep me awake at night." "Why stay?" I asked. She looked toward the trees, sighing. "I'm the campground host. If I don't, who will? But if I were you, I'd leave before it gets worse." My pride wouldn't let me go. I had work to do, and part of me wanted to prove there was a rational explanation. That night, I set up a makeshift alarm system. A few tin cans tied to the door handle so I could at least hear if someone tried to sneak in. I left a bright flashlight by my pillow. Hours passed in tense silence until I drifted off in the early morning hours. At some point before dawn, I woke to a rustling sound inside the RV. The tin cans shook, and I heard heavy breathing. My heart nearly stopped. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. In that narrow beam, I caught a glimpse of a figure, about my height, standing near the kitchenette. It wore clothes that looked identical to mine, down to the black hoodie and faded jeans I'd hung up earlier. My mind reeled. Was someone really wearing my clothes? "Who are you?" I croaked, voice trembling. The figure turned its head toward me. In the dim light, I saw it had my face, or something eerily close. The features were slightly off, as if the skin didn't quite fit. A guttural sound came from its throat and my hair stood on end. I shouted, lurching forward to chase it, but it darted for the door. The tin cans clattered as it yanked the door open and disappeared outside. By the time I scrambled after it, the figure was gone, lost in the pre-dawn gloom. I slammed the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably. That thing, that intruder, looked just like me. It was impossible, but I'd seen it. Panic flared, and I realized I needed help. But who would believe a story about a double? Some kind of doppelganger. The next hours were a blur. As soon as it was light, I found Officer Whitaker and told him everything. He stared at me like I was half crazy, but the mention of someone physically inside my RV with my clothing made him promise to investigate. He left me at a picnic table while he interviewed a few other campers. Then he returned, frowning. "We have bigger problems. A local teenager's gone missing. JJ never came home last night." I felt a cold jolt of fear. "JJ, you think he's mixed up in this?" "Not sure. Some footprints lead from a fishing spot near the lake up to the campground, but then vanish. His parents are frantic." Whitaker looked pained, probably recalling that I'd found strange footprints myself. "Let us know if you see or hear anything." When Whitaker left to coordinate a search, I realized the doppelganger could be trying to frame me. What if people thought I lured JJ away? My stomach lurched as that possibility dawned on me. Taking a deep breath, I decided to go out and look for JJ myself. The idea of wandering the woods where a shape-shifting intruder lurked terrified me, but I felt compelled to help. I armed myself with a sturdy wooden mallet, part of my carving tools, and ventured along a narrow trail that wound into the deeper forest. The midday sun filtered through the canopy, leaving the forest floor in shifting patches of light and shadow. I watched every shape, every rustle, half expecting to see my own face peering at me from behind a tree. An hour later, I stumbled onto a clearing. Remnants of half-eaten animal carcasses lay scattered, buzzing with flies. My stomach churned. Closer inspection revealed footprints. Some seemed human, though deformed, with weird lengths between steps. Others looked like heavy, half-formed prints. Something guttural echoed from deeper in the woods, and my blood ran cold. I took a step back, heart pounding in my ears. Suddenly, I saw a silhouette at the edge of the clearing. It was me, or the same false version of me. The figure wore what looked like the exact outfit I had on this morning, minus the jacket. I froze, my pulse hammering. It stared silently, then let out that same low, rasping sound. A flicker of recognition or intelligence shone in its eyes, as though it relished my fear. I raised the mallet, voice trembling. "Where's JJ? What do you want?" It didn't speak, but it made a clicking noise, stepping sideways. Its posture was slightly hunched, arms too long, fingers twitching. I noticed a watery sheen across its features, like poorly molded clay. Lightning, quick, it darted behind a tree and vanished. Terrified, I ran, not caring about stealth anymore. I had to get away. As I tore through the undergrowth, a storm rolled in overhead. Thunder rumbled, and I nearly slipped on wet leaves. By the time I reached the outskirts of the campground, rain poured down in heavy sheets. My clothes were soaked, my face scratched by branches. Several panicked voices erupted from nearby sites. People shouting about seeing me rummaging through their tents or me sprinting past. My heart clenched. The doppelganger was apparently running rampant, sowing confusion. I approached a group of campers, and they jerked back as if I were a criminal. "You just tore through here," one woman yelled, fear in her eyes. "You had a knife or something, and you scared my kids." I shook my head, water dripping from my hair. "That wasn't me, I swear. Something is out here imitating people." But they obviously didn't believe me. Suddenly, Officer Whitaker's patrol truck roared up, splashing mud. He jumped out, a flashlight in one hand, his other hand on his holster. "Mark, what's going on?" he demanded. "I've got multiple reports." I cut him off, breathless. "It's not me. It's that thing, my double. Listen, I saw it in the woods, near some carcasses. We need to search. JJ might be..." Whitaker hesitated, eyes flicking to the campers who glared at me with suspicion. "Okay," he said finally. "You're coming with me, though. I can't have you roaming around alone if people think you're the one terrorizing them." He ordered the onlookers back to their sites, then nodded for me to get into his truck. He drove us to a narrower trailhead leading deeper into the forest. The rain hammered the windshield, lightning illuminating the gnarled trunks. My gut twisted as I realized how dire this was. JJ was still missing, and this creature was apparently using my form to ramp up fear. We pulled over, stepping out into knee-high grass. Whitaker held a rifle, scanning the woods with his flashlight. "Stay close," he muttered. "Yell if you see anything." Branches whipped our faces as we made slow progress. The storm made everything slick and treacherous. Then we spotted a faint glow up ahead, a flashlight beam. We hurried toward it, calling JJ's name. The glow disappeared for a moment, then reappeared. When we reached a small clearing, we found a collapsed shed half buried in vines. The door was ajar, and faint light flickered inside. My heart pounded as I followed Whitaker in. The cramped space smelled of damp rot. Rusty tools lined the walls, and the flashlight lay on the floor, flickering. Beside it sat a trembling figure, JJ, bruised and wide-eyed. He looked up, fear etched into his face. "Mark, officer, it attacked me." He clutched a bloody scrape on his arm. "I was fishing. Saw something that looked like you, Mark, but it wasn't right. Next thing I knew, it lunged, tore at my arm." Relief washed over me at seeing him alive, but panic bubbled underneath. Whitaker started to call for backup on his radio, but static filled the line, likely the storm's interference. Suddenly, something thumped against the side of the shed. The entire structure shuddered. We scrambled, rifles and flashlights aimed at the door. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating a silhouette in the threshold. Again, I saw my own face staring back at me with glassy, inhuman eyes. Whitaker cursed under his breath, stepping forward with his rifle raised. "Hands up!" he barked. "Whoever you are, freeze!" The shape's mouth twitched into a grimace, an almost smile that wavered like a reflection on disturbed water. Then it lunged. Whitaker fired a shot that clipped the creature's shoulder, producing a sickening splatter of dark fluid. The creature hissed, reeling back. In the strobing lightning, its form rippled, as though trying to hold on to my image. For a heartbeat, I saw a monstrous, sinewy outline underneath the stolen face, all elongated limbs and bony ridges. It screeched, then bolted into the stormy night. Whitaker, breathing heavily, lowered his rifle. "What the hell was that?" JJ whimpered, clinging to me as I helped him stand. "Now, do you believe me?" I asked, voice shaking. We limped out of the shed, battered by wind and rain. The storm showed no sign of letting up. I half-carried JJ while Whitaker led the way back to the truck. Every rustle in the brush made us jump, fearing the creature might return. Finally, the headlights appeared through the trees. We hustled inside, locking the doors. The engine roared, and Whitaker sped toward the campground. When we arrived, paramedics took JJ, and a few more officers from a nearby jurisdiction arrived. Whitaker quickly filled them in, though he left out the more unbelievable details, simply calling the attacker a deranged individual. He did confirm that the suspect resembled me down to my clothes. No one said the word doppelganger, but it was written on every face. The authorities formed a search party, but the storm soon rendered it too dangerous to continue. They planned to try again at first light. By then, my RV was the last place I wanted to be, but I felt compelled to gather my belongings. At dawn, the rain stopped, leaving the campground soaked. The few campers who remained were packing up in a panic. Marjorie caught me at my RV door, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have let it get this bad. I knew there were stories, and now this. God, I'm so sorry." I nodded grimly, not knowing what else to say. The illusions and theories swirling in my mind were too overwhelming. As I collected my gear, I realized I couldn't just flee without knowing if that creature was still out there. But my rational side reminded me that tangling with it again could be suicidal. Still, I needed closure, or proof. Late that morning, against better judgment, I volunteered to help Officer Whitaker and a smaller search party comb an area where they suspected the creature might lair. If we could at least chase it off for good or confirm it was gone, I could leave with some peace of mind. We ventured into the deepest part of the woods, where a rocky outcrop hinted at possible caves or dens. The stench of rot grew strong, leading us to a half-collapsed underground passage. Whitaker and I descended, flashlights sweeping across dripping walls and scattered debris. Torn clothing, old bones, human and animal, lay in muddled heaps, a horrifying testament to how long this thing might have stalked the area. Within the dim recess, we heard shallow breathing and a series of guttural clicks. My pulse thundered in my ears. Then the creature launched itself at one of the officers, toppling him. Whitaker fired again, shouting. I saw the creature in a flash of muzzle fire, a hideously contorted shape, half wearing my face, half an elongated nightmare. A reflection in a puddle at its feet showed no definable features, only a warped blackness. My stomach turned. In the chaos, I realized the ceiling of the passage was unstable. Thinking fast, I grabbed a fallen timber beam and jammed it upward, prying loose a section of rock. The roof collapsed in a thunderous roar. A wall of stone and earth slid down, momentarily crushing the creature beneath the rubble. Its shriek tore the air, echoing down the passage. The officers pulled me back just as dust billowed everywhere. We coughed, eyes watering. I strained to see if the doppelganger was truly done for. When the dust settled, we heard nothing but dripping water. No sign of movement behind the rocks. One of the officers said they'd bring a team to excavate, but I could see on Whitaker's face that he believed we might have sealed it, or at least forced it deeper underground. None of us relished digging through to find it if it was still alive. By late afternoon, the group escorted me back to the campground. I retrieved the remainder of my tools and said my goodbyes. JJ, though shaken, was treated for his injuries and gave me a nod of gratitude. Marjorie wept openly, apologizing for not warning me sooner. She managed a wan smile through her tears, telling me the next place I camp would surely be safer. I couldn't bring myself to feel anger toward her. She was a victim of this place too. I left Jim Edgar Panther Creek that same evening, my RV rattling along the roads until I hit the nearest highway. Despite exhaustion, I drove miles before finally stopping for the night at a well-lit truck stop. I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel, mind swirling with all I'd witnessed. My phone was filled with odd, blurred pictures, the only physical evidence that any of this was real. No official report would ever confirm a shape-shifting entity. People would read about a suspected prowler or coyote attack. The rest would fade into local legend. Even now, I sometimes wake in the night, expecting to see my own face staring back at me from the shadows. And I can't help but check my reflection in every mirror, every puddle, half afraid it won't match the man I think I am. I survived that place, but I left a piece of myself, my peace of mind, amid those Illinois woods. As I continue traveling from fair to fair, I cling to the hope that I buried that evil for good. Yet there's always a gnawing doubt. What if it's still out there, wearing my face, waiting for someone else to wander by in the dark? My name is Naomi Brooks, and I'm 37 years old. This happened a few weeks ago, in early autumn, while I was parked with my RV near Castle Rock State Park in northern Illinois. I'd been traveling the Midwest, chasing scenic landscapes for a photography piece I was pitching to a magazine. Castle Rock had a reputation for dramatic limestone bluffs and sunrise fog on the Rock River, perfect for haunting, moody shots that editors usually loved. I expected an easy, peaceful stay filled with nothing but scenic photography. Instead, I stumbled onto something terrifying. On my first afternoon there, I pulled into a campsite on a bluff overlooking the river. The place was mostly empty. Only a couple of other RVs and one old pop-up camper were spread out under the tall oaks and maples. The leaves had just begun changing color, creating a canopy of gold and red above us. I parked, turned off my engine, and took a moment to breathe in the crisp air. That was when a uniformed park ranger approached. He was tall, probably in his mid-40s, with a rugged face and a cap pulled low over his forehead. Something struck me as odd the moment he walked up. His skin was pale, paler than anyone I'd seen in a long time, especially someone who supposedly worked outdoors. He introduced himself as Glenn Adams, checked my permit, and jotted my license plate number down. He barely made eye contact. "You planning to stay long?" he asked. His voice was calm, but had a strange undertone like he was reciting from a script. "A few nights, maybe," I said. "I'm doing some photography in the area." "That's good," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just be careful near the bluffs after dark. Some folks have wandered too close to the edge. Accidents happen." He tipped his cap and walked away before I could ask more. At that moment, I just shrugged it off. Park rangers see so many accidents, it made sense he'd caution me. But later, I'd look back and realize how off his behavior was. I set up my RV, hooking up power, and spent the rest of the day scouting angles along the trails. Castle Rock was stunning. Tall limestone formations jutted out over the river, and morning fog often drifted through the trees. I couldn't wait to capture it at dawn. By the time evening fell, I was exhausted. I cooked a small dinner in my RV and turned in early. Around midnight, I woke to a faint scraping noise against the outside of my RV. For a split second, half asleep, I thought maybe a branch was brushing against it. But the sound repeated, like metal scraping metal. I flicked on a small lantern and crept to the window. My heart pounded as I peered out. No movement, no silhouette, just shadows shifting in the faint moonlight. I convinced myself it was an animal or a loose part of the RV being knocked by the breeze. Eventually, I dozed off again. The next morning, I saw small puncture marks, almost like bite marks, in the aluminum siding near the back wheel well. It was bizarre. Some part of me wanted to believe a raccoon with sharp teeth had tried gnawing on my RV, but that made no sense. I took a few photos of the damage, mostly for insurance. It left me a bit uneasy, so I decided to head into a nearby town to ask around and gather local color for my article. The nearest watering hole was a cozy roadside bar called the River Roost. I met a bartender named Marisol Green, a talkative woman in her late 20s with warm brown eyes. As I nursed a soda, I casually mentioned the strange marks on my RV. Marisol glanced around to make sure no one else was listening and said, "This area's had some weird incidents for years. People go missing, or they turn up dead, drained of blood. It's rare, so outsiders don't hear much, but locals whisper about it. Some blame wildlife, others talk about a curse." "Drained of blood?" I repeated, feeling a chill run down my spine. "That sounds like an urban legend," she sighed. "That's what I thought too, until a camper washed up last spring. Coroner's report said near total exsanguination. Real hush-hush." A wry laugh escaped me. That's insane. You're serious?" She pressed her lips into a thin line. "I'm serious. The rumor around here is that Castle Rock used to be home to some eccentric aristocrat in the 1800s, rumored to practice dark rites. People say he never died. Ridiculous, right?" Her eyes flicked away, betraying her own uncertainty. I thought of Glenn Adams, so pale and aloof. But vampiric aristocrats were the stuff of bad horror movies, not real life. Yet the conversation lingered in my mind as I drove back to the campground. Before I could start editing my photos, I realized I'd left my lens cap outside. Stepping out of the RV, I nearly collided with an older man rummaging through a storage compartment on his own motorhome. He introduced himself as Kenny Harlow, a retired truck driver who spent his days roaming the country in his RV. We struck up a conversation. I told him about the strange noises last night and the puncture marks. "Probably some troublemaker," Kenny said, adjusting his cap. "Though I have seen Glenn wandering around late. Thought it was weird. Never once saw him in the full daylight. He'll say hi in the morning, but he's always in the shade or inside the station." I relayed what Marisol told me at the bar about missing campers and blood-drained bodies. Kenny paled. "That's a new one, but I don't dismiss local gossip. Some nights I've heard unexplainable screams coming from the direction of the limestone caves below Castle Rock. Hard to get to, steep drop-offs and thick brush. Maybe kids exploring, or maybe something worse." His words sank in as I recalled the hollow scrapes on my RV. Goosebumps prickled my arms. I forced a laugh. Well, I'm just here for the photos. That night, I reviewed the shots I'd taken along the bluffs, searching for that perfect money-making image. My camera battery was nearly dead, so I hooked it to a charger, planning an early wake-up to photograph the sunrise. The forest around me was silent. No wind, no owls. It felt unnervingly still. Sometime past midnight, I heard a faint thud outside, followed by a dragging sound like something being pulled across gravel. Fear coiled in my gut. Remembering the puncture marks, I grabbed a flashlight and approached the RV door. Slowly, I swung it open. Darkness greeted me, starlight barely illuminating the treetops. Then, to my left, I noticed movement. A pale figure crouched near my water hookup. My heart hammered. I aimed the flashlight. The beam caught a glimpse of a gaunt face, a man, or something shaped like a man. His eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. He sprang backward with inhuman speed, vanishing into the shadows. Shaking, I slammed and locked the door. The entire RV felt too vulnerable, like tinfoil against an unknown predator. At dawn, I discovered fresh damage near the water hookup. Deeper scratches and more of those small puncture marks. Furious and rattled, I gathered my camera equipment, intending to show the evidence to Glenn or any official. But Glenn was nowhere to be found, so I drove to the nearby town for the second time, heading straight to the library. If old local rumors existed, I wanted to read them myself. In the musty archives, I found a handful of references to a count or baron who built a lavish estate on the limestone cliffs in the mid-1800s. Accounts varied, but all hinted that the occupant had dark, secretive ways. Servants vanished, and the estate eventually burned. Rumors claimed the occupant escaped into a labyrinth of caves under the rock. The words "drank life" and "blood mania" came up in a few sensational newspaper snippets. Despite my cynicism, the parallels to modern vanishings were unnerving. Hurrying back to camp, I nearly jumped out of my skin when Glenn Adams materialized behind my RV. It was late afternoon, and he lurked in the shade of a tall oak, arms folded across his chest. I must have looked guilty, hugging my camera bag like a lifeline. "Where'd you go?" he asked politely, but an edge laced his tone. Into town. Doing research for my article," I managed, trying not to stare at his unnaturally pale complexion. His eyes darted to my camera bag, then back to me. "I'd be careful who you talk to. Not everything around here is meant to be dug up," he said softly, stepping aside to let me pass. I muttered some excuse and slipped inside, my heart pounding. That evening, I didn't dare sleep. I set my camera on a tripod by the RV window, hitting record in hopes of catching any intruder on video. Around midnight, as exhaustion weighed on me, a piercing noise jolted me awake. The scrape of metal outside. Heart racing, I glanced at my camera's live feed on the attached display. Through the lens, I saw something approach the side of my RV. It wore a hooded jacket, but the faint glow of the campsite lights caught a pale, elongated face, with the two protruding canines shining. My skin crawled. Suddenly, the figure lifted its head, as if sensing the camera. It turned slowly, and I saw an older style of facial features, sunken cheeks and a thin mouth. Then, with impossibly fluid speed, it streaked out of the frame. I rushed to the window, scanning the darkness, but saw no one. Adrenaline kept me shaking for minutes. Morning light brought me to tears of relief. I played back the footage, enough to confirm something unnatural was out there. I ran straight to Kenny's site and showed him the clip. His face paled. "I've never seen anything like that, Naomi. This is real then, good God." He urged me to stay calm and talk to Marisol, who might help us contact the authorities. We made a plan. He'd stand guard around my RV that night, and I'd see if Marisol knew a trustworthy county officer we could involve. If the local ranger, Glenn, was in league with this creature, we needed someone else. I tracked down Marisol at the bar. She didn't look surprised by the footage. "Now you see why people vanish," she whispered. "My cousin works for the next county's sheriff's department. I'll try to get her out here quietly, but if you want my advice, you'll pack up and leave. This town's been under a shadow too long." Stepping outside, I found Glenn leaning against my RV again as if waiting for me. "Naomi, I'm concerned about your well-being. People talk. They say you're stirring up trouble, looking for things better left alone." An icy dread gripped me. "I just want to take pictures. I'm leaving soon anyway." He stared, unblinking. "Tomorrow, then," he said, stepping away. "Before sundown, trust me." He turned, disappearing behind a row of pines. Kenny insisted on helping me pack right then, but I wanted one more shot at capturing that perfect sunrise. Stubbornness, or maybe stupidity, pushed me to wait. We agreed I'd leave right after tomorrow's dawn shoot, hopefully never looking back. That night, Kenny parked his RV close to mine so we could watch each other's rigs. Around 1 a.m, I caught a flicker of movement near the edge of the woods. My stomach twisted when I recognized Glenn's shape approaching from behind a tree. accompanied by a gaunt figure cloaked in black. I quickly turned off all lights in my RV, hoping to stay unnoticed. They crept closer, their voices low. Then, in the gloom, I saw the hooded figure slip from Glenn's side and sprint to Kenny's RV door. A terrified yelp erupted from inside. Without thinking, I grabbed my camera and the first makeshift weapon I could find, a heavy metal tripod leg. Racing out, I found the door to Kenny's RV ajar. Inside, the hooded figure had pinned him against the kitchenette, fangs inches from his throat. Blood trickled from a fresh wound on Kenny's arm. I screamed, swinging the tripod leg with all the force I had. It clanged against the intruder's back. The creature hissed and spun around, eyes burning red, canines bared. I recognized the same face from my camera feed. In a flash, it grabbed me by the wrist, its grip cold and impossibly strong. My vision swam as I fought to stay conscious. Suddenly, Kenny, half in shock, jabbed the creature with a kitchen knife. It snarled, letting me go. In that instant, I lifted my camera and hit the flash repeatedly. Each strobe of bright light forced the creature back, disoriented. I caught a glimpse of Glenn lurking in the doorway, expression twisted with what might have been guilt or fear. Then the hooded vampire bolted out into the night, leaving Kenny slumped to the floor, panting in pain. I ran to the RV doorway, just in time to see Glenn vanish into the darkness as well. Kenny's wounds weren't fatal, but he was weak, shaking from blood loss. I tried calling for help, but we had almost no cell signal. In desperation, we drove our RVs in convoy along the back roads, headed for the nearest town with a hospital. The entire way, we kept expecting the vampire to leap from the tree line. Every shadow seemed alive. At dawn, we reached a small clinic. Kenny was whisked in, and the nurses gawked at the strange bite marks on his arm. They insisted on contacting local authorities, so we told them only that he was attacked by a wild animal. I doubted they'd believe the truth anyway. While Kenny was treated, I sat in the waiting area, replaying the last few days in my head. Glenn's words echoed. Trust me. Tomorrow, before sundown. We ended up meeting with Marisol's cousin, a sympathetic deputy from the next county. She took our statement, but confessed there wasn't much she could do without proof. When I showed her the pictures, the partial footage of that monstrous face, she went pale, but tried to keep calm. "We'll send a unit up that way," she said quietly, likely thinking it was some horrifyingly realistic hoax. Kenny decided to leave the area immediately. I agreed. There was no final confrontation at Castle Rock, no triumphant staking in a hidden crypt. We simply fled, convinced that the vampire and whoever served it would vanish again into the caves or an abandoned estate. Maybe the police found something, maybe not. I never heard another official word. Even now, parked in a distant state, I can't shake the nightmares. Sometimes I jolt awake, certain I hear the scrape of sharp teeth against metal. My photos remain the only proof of what happened. A few fleeting frames of a pale face and canine fangs captured in the corner of a lens. Editors, I show them to think they're staged or manipulated. All I know is that Castle Rock isn't safe, that something ancient and bloodthirsty still roams those limestone bluffs. And maybe the worst part is realizing how easily people can ignore or hide the truth when it threatens the comfortable order of things. I survived by a stroke of luck and by a flash of light, but I'll never forget the terror in those eyes, or Glenn's pale figure stepping aside to let his master feed. I'm telling this story because if you ever find yourself alone at Castle Rock State Park after dark, hearing strange footsteps near your RV, you'll know it's not just the wind. It might be the next knock on your door, the next scrape against your wall, the next set of fangs ready to turn a scenic campsite into a nightmare. Be warned, and if you value your blood, leave before sundown. My name is Emily Hart, and I'm 37 years old. This happened a few weeks ago in early autumn while I was parked with my RV near Starved Rock State Park in northern Illinois. I'd been traveling the Midwest, chasing scenic landscapes for a photography piece I was pitching to a magazine. Starved Rock had a reputation for dramatic limestone bluffs and sunrise fog on the Rock River, perfect for haunting, moody shots that editors usually loved. I expected an easy, peaceful stay filled with nothing but scenic photography. Instead, I stumbled onto something terrifying. I arrived at Starved Rock State Park on a crisp Saturday afternoon. The park was less crowded than usual, with only a handful of other RVs scattered under the tall oaks and maples. I found my spot on a secluded bluff overlooking the Rock River, setting up my RV with practiced ease. As I worked, I couldn't help but admire the beauty around me. The vibrant colors of the changing leaves, the serene flow of the river below, and the imposing limestone cliffs that seemed to touch the sky. By late afternoon, I met Glenn Turner, the park ranger, who approached my RV with a clipboard in hand. He was tall, probably in his mid-40s, with a rugged build and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His skin was unusually pale, almost ghostly against the backdrop of the vibrant foliage. "Welcome to Starved Rock, Miss Hart," Glenn said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes seemed distant, as if he were seeing something beyond my presence. "I hope you enjoy your stay. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thanks, Glenn. I'm really looking forward to capturing some great shots here," I replied, shaking his hand. There was something slightly off about him, but I brushed it aside, assuming it was just the stress of the job. That evening, after setting up my photography equipment, I decided to take a walk along one of the trails to scout locations for sunrise. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, the perfect antidote to the burnout I'd been experiencing back home. When I returned to my RV, the sky had darkened, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle. I prepared a simple dinner, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables providing a soothing backdrop to my thoughts. After eating, I decided to review the photos I'd taken earlier, hoping to find that one perfect shot that would make my article stand out. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was low battery, prompting me to charge it. I connected it to the RV's power supply and went back to my meal, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease that had settled in my stomach. Sleep eluded me that night, thanks to the insomnia that had plagued me for weeks. Sometime past midnight, I was jolted awake by a faint scraping noise outside my RV. My heart raced as I strained to listen. It sounded like metal against metal, rhythmic and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the window cautiously. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows dancing among the trees. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just a branch brushing against the side of the RV. Still, the sound repeated, each scrape more deliberate than the last. Unable to sleep, I decided to investigate. Stepping outside, the cool night air hit me, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam sweeping over the rocks and foliage. Suddenly, I saw it. A pale figure crouched near the water hookup, its elongated limbs barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as the figure lifted its head, revealing a face so pale it seemed almost translucent, eyes hollow and haunting. Before I could react, the figure vanished into the shadows with unnatural speed, leaving me standing alone in the night. Trembling, I slammed the RV door shut and locked it, my mind racing. Was it a trick of the light, an animal, or something else entirely? The next morning, I discovered fresh puncture marks on the aluminum siding near the back wheel well, small, precise holes that looked like bite marks. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize the damage. Raccoons? Birds? It didn't add up. I took a few photos for documentation and decided to seek answers. I drove a few miles into the nearby town, a quaint place with a single main street and a handful of shops. My first stop was the park's visitor center, where I met Marisol Green, a local historian who volunteered her time to help visitors. She was in her early 50s, with an elegant demeanor and a keen interest in the park's lore. "I've been hearing some strange things," I began, showing her the photos of the puncture marks. "People have reported missing campers, and there are rumors about a ghostly apparition known as the White Lady. Do you know anything about that?" Marisol nodded, her expression somber. "Yes. The legend of the White Lady is well known around here. They say she was a woman named Eleanor who lost her life tragically in the canyon years ago. Some believe she still roams these woods, seeking revenge or peace. Sightings usually involve her near the riverbank or at the edge of the bluffs." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't a believer in ghosts, but the mounting evidence made me question my skepticism. "Has there been any recent activity? Missing persons? Strange sightings?" She sighed. "There have been a few disappearances over the past few years all around the same area. The authorities chalk it up to accidents or wildlife, but locals aren't convinced. They keep an eye out and try to avoid the bluffs after dark." Feeling a mix of fear and curiosity, I thanked her and decided to visit Glenn Turner, hoping he could shed more light on the situation. Back at the campground, Glenn greeted me with the same polite but distant demeanor. I decided to broach the subject cautiously. "Glenn, I spoke with Marisol Green. Can you tell me more about the White Lady sightings? Have you seen her yourself?" Glenn's eyes flickered briefly to mine before he leaned in, lowering his voice. "I've heard the stories, Emily. Some nights I've seen her near the river, especially when the fog rolls in. It's hard to explain, but it's unsettling." His admission only deepened my unease. "Do you think there's any truth to the legend? Could Eleanor really be haunting these woods?" Glenn hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the distant bluffs. "I don't know, Emily. I've seen strange things, but I can't say for certain. Just be careful, okay? Avoid the riverbank after dark." I nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and fear. That night, I decided to stay inside my RV, determined to get some rest. But sleep was elusive. The haunted whispers of Eleanor's legend echoed in my mind as I stared at the ceiling, the camera beside me unused. Around 2 in the morning, the same scraping noise returned, louder and more deliberate. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and approached the window once again. This time, I saw a faint, glowing figure standing near the back wheel well. A ghostly silhouette dressed in flowing white, her face hidden by long dark hair. She looked directly at me, her eyes hollow and sorrowful before vanishing into the night. I stumbled back inside, breathless and shaken. The fear was paralyzing, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, determined to get to the bottom of this, I returned to the visitor center to speak with Marisol again. She listened intently as I recounted my midnight encounter. "There have been similar reports," she said quietly. "Some say the White Lady is trying to communicate. Others believe she's seeking vengeance. Whatever her intent, it's clear she's linked to the disappearances. If you're planning to stay, be vigilant. Don't wander off alone, especially near the river." Her warning hung heavy in the air as I returned to my RV. The day was overcast, and the forest seemed quieter than usual. I decided to take some photos along the trails, hoping to capture any unusual activity. As I walked, the tranquility of the woods was interrupted by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Suddenly, a chill wind swept through the trees, and I felt a presence watching me. I stopped, heart racing, and scanned the area with my camera. Nothing. Shaking off the feeling, I continued, but the sense of being followed lingered. When I reached a clearing near the riverbank, I saw a figure in the distance, dressed in white, moving gracefully among the rocks. My breath caught as I realized it was Eleanor, the White Lady. She looked up, her sorrowful eyes meeting mine, and then she faded into the mist. Terrified yet fascinated, I took a few photos and decided to head back. As I approached my RV, I noticed something odd. My equipment had been tampered with. My camera lens was scratched and my tripod was broken. Whoever, or whatever, had done this wanted to leave a message. That night, I reviewed the photos, hoping to find some clue. One image stood out, a blurred figure with hollow eyes staring directly into the lens. My skin crawled as I realized the White Lady had managed to leave her mark through my own equipment. Determined to uncover the truth, I spent the next day delving deeper into the park's history. Marisol provided me with old maps and documents, revealing that Eleanor had been a young woman who lost her family in a tragic accident in the canyon. Rumors suggested she had turned to dark rituals to cope, eventually leading to her untimely death. Some believed her spirit was bound to the land, restless and vengeful. As dusk approached, I decided to take one last walk to the riverbank, hoping to capture more evidence. The fog was rolling in thick, shrouding the path in an ethereal blanket. My flashlight cut through the mist, revealing the haunting beauty of the canyon. Suddenly, I heard soft, mournful humming. Eleanor's song, or was it a plea? I followed the sound, drawn towards the river. There, standing at the water's edge, was Eleanor, her white gown billowing in the wind, eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Help me," she whispered, her voice like the rustling leaves. "Find peace." Before I could respond, Glenn Turner emerged from the shadows, his expression grave. "Emily, you need to leave, now. It's not safe." Confusion and fear battled within me. "What do you mean? What's happening here, Glenn?" Glenn's eyes darkened. "Eleanor is restless. Some nights she reaches out, trying to draw people into her sorrow. It's dangerous. You're too close." I backed away, but Eleanor advanced, her form shimmering in the moonlight. "Stay and help me," she pleaded, her voice filled with longing. "I can't move on alone." Glenn grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "She's not to be trusted. The disappearances, the damage to your RV, it's her doing. We've tried everything to appease her, but she won't let go." Desperation clawed at me. "How can we help her? What does she want?" Glenn shook his head. "It's beyond our understanding. We need to contain her, prevent her from harming more people. You need to leave before it's too late." As if on cue, the temperature plummeted, and the air thickened with a palpable sense of dread. Eleanor let out a wail that pierced the night, and the forest around us seemed to come alive with whispers and shadows. I could feel her sorrow, her pain, pressing down on me. Without thinking, I broke free from Glenn's grip, stumbling backward. "I can't just leave her here to suffer," I cried, my voice echoing through the canyon. "There has to be another way." Glenn's expression hardened. "It's not your fight, Emily. Leave before she turns her attention to you." Before I could argue further, Eleanor lunged at me, her form shifting and distorting. Panic surged through me as I tried to fend her off, but she moved with supernatural speed. her icy hands gripping my shoulders, pulling me toward the river. Glenn stepped in, trying to restrain her, but his efforts only seemed to anger her more. In the chaos, I remembered the camera. Desperate, I reached for it, flipping it on and pointing the flash directly at Eleanor's face. The intense burst of light momentarily disoriented her, and I saw her true form, a spectral entity with hollow eyes and ethereal, flowing hair. The flash disrupted her, causing her to recoil and release me. Glenn seized the opportunity to grab me, pulling me away from the river. "We need to get out of here now," he shouted, dragging me toward the RV. As we fled, the forest seemed to close in around us, shadows dancing and whispering. Eleanor's presence lingered, her wails echoing through the trees, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that bound her spirit to Starved Rock. We reached the RV just as the first light of dawn broke through the fog. Exhausted and shaken, I watched as Glenn made sure the RV was secure before giving me a final, solemn nod. "Take care, Emily. Stay safe out there," he said quietly. I didn't need any more encouragement. I packed up my gear swiftly, eager to leave the haunted woods behind. As I drove away, the park receded into the distance, but the memory of Eleanor's sorrowful eyes and the night's terror remained etched in my mind. That night, safe in my bed far from Starved Rock, I couldn't sleep. The whispers of the White Lady haunted my dreams, her pleas for help echoing in the silence. I knew I had to share her story, to honor her memory, and perhaps help her find peace. But part of me feared that by telling her tale, I might keep her spirit tethered to the living world, perpetuating the cycle of fear and tragedy. Months have passed since that harrowing experience. I've published the article, complete with my chilling photographs and the tragic story of Eleanor. Feedback was mixed. Some found it compelling, others dismissed it as embellished folklore. But for me, the truth was clear. There are places where the past refuses to fade, where spirits linger, bound by unfinished business and sorrow. I still visit the site occasionally, driven by a mix of professional curiosity and personal connection. I try to capture moments of peace, but the memory of that night remains a shadow over every sunset and sunrise. The legend of the White Lady lives on, a reminder that some stories are more than just tales. They're echoes of lost souls yearning for resolution. And if you ever find yourself alone at Starved Rock State Park after dark, hearing soft whispers carried by the wind, remember Eleanor. Respect her presence, honor her story, and tread carefully among the limestone cliffs. Because some spirits aren't meant to be disturbed, and their longing for peace can turn the serene wilderness into a nightmare of whispers and shadows. My name is Daniel Danny King, and I'm 41 years old. This happened a few weeks ago in the heart of Shawnee National Forest, southern Illinois. After years of firefighting in the city, dealing with trauma and physical limitations from an injury on the job, I decided to seek solace in nature. I bought an old RV, renovated it myself, and embarked on a solo journey to find peace and clarity amidst the serene landscapes. Shawnee's Garden of the Gods had always intrigued me with its rugged sandstone formations and dense woodlands. I hoped that capturing its beauty through my lens would not only help me heal, but also provide material for my freelance photography work. I arrived at the remote RV campsite near Garden of the Gods on a crisp Saturday afternoon. The area was secluded, surrounded by towering oaks and maples, their leaves a vibrant tapestry of autumn colors. There were only a few other RVs scattered around, each one a solitary haven amidst the vast forest. Setting up my RV took a couple of hours, a routine I had become adept at over my travels. Once everything was in place, I stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool, earthy air. The tranquility was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, I decided to take a walk along one of the trails to scout locations for sunrise photography. The path meandered through dense underbrush, leading me to a vantage point that offered a breathtaking view of the river below and the sandstone cliffs rising majestically into the sky. The beauty of the place was humbling, and I felt a rare moment of peace wash over me. Returning to the RV, I noticed Glenn Turner, the park ranger, approaching with a clipboard in hand. He was a tall man, rugged and weathered from years spent outdoors. His skin was unusually pale, almost ghostly against the vibrant backdrop of the forest. "Welcome to Shawnee, Mr. King," Glenn greeted, his voice steady but distant. He extended his hand, which I shook firmly. "I hope you enjoy your stay. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thanks, Glenn. I'm really looking forward to capturing some great shots here," I replied, trying to keep the unease from his pale demeanor out of my voice. There was something slightly off about him, but I dismissed it as perhaps the exhaustion of his job. That evening, after setting up my photography equipment, I decided to review the photos I'd taken earlier. The fading light cast eerie shadows across the images, adding a haunting quality to the already dramatic scenery. As I sifted through the shots, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation for the next morning's golden hour. Around midnight, my peace was shattered by a faint scraping noise against the side of the RV. My heart raced as I strained to listen. It sounded like metal against metal, rhythmic and deliberate. Grabbing my flashlight, I approached the window cautiously. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the silhouettes of trees swaying gently in the night breeze. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just a branch brushing against the RV. Still, the sound repeated, each scrape more deliberate than the last. Unable to ignore it, I stepped outside, the cool night air prickling my skin. The moon was full, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam dancing over rocks and foliage. Suddenly, I saw it. A pale, shadowy figure crouched near the water hookup. My breath caught in my throat as the figure lifted its head, revealing hollow, haunting eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Before I could react, the figure vanished into the shadows with unnatural speed, leaving me standing alone in the night. Trembling, I slammed the RV door shut and locked it, my mind racing. Was it a trick of the light? An animal? Or something else entirely? The next morning, I found fresh puncture marks on the aluminum siding near the back wheel well. Small, precise holes that looked disturbingly like bite marks. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize the damage. Raccoons? Birds? It didn't add up. I took a few photos for documentation and decided to seek answers. Driving a few miles into the nearby town, I headed straight for the park's visitor center. The building was modest, with maps and brochures neatly arranged on the counters. I met Marisol Green, a local historian who volunteered her time to help visitors. She was in her early 50s, with an elegant demeanor and an air of mystery that seemed to align with the legends she cherished. "I've been hearing some strange things," I began, showing her the photos of the puncture marks. "People have reported missing campers, and there are rumors about a ghostly apparition known as the Shadow Walker. Do you know anything about that?" Marisol nodded, her expression turning somber. "Yes, the legend of the Shadow Walker is well known around here. They say it's an entity that prowls these woods, especially during twilight and heavy fog. It thrives on fear and confusion, preying on those who wander too close to the river or the canyon edges. Some believe it can mimic voices and movements to lure people deeper into the forest." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't a believer in ghosts or legends, but the mounting evidence made me question my skepticism. Has there been any recent activity, missing persons, strange sightings? She sighed, leaning against the counter. There have been a few disappearances over the past few years, all around the same area. The authorities chalk it up to accidents or wildlife, but locals aren't convinced. They keep an eye out and try to avoid the bluffs after dark. Feeling a mix of fear and curiosity, I thanked her and decided to seek out Glenn Turner, hoping he could shed more light on the situation. Back at the campground, Glenn greeted me with the same polite but distant demeanor. "Glenn, I spoke with Marisol Green. Can you tell me more about the Shadow Walker sightings? Have you seen it yourself?" Glenn's eyes flickered briefly to mine before he leaned in, lowering his voice. "I've heard the stories, Danny. Some nights I've seen it near the river, especially when the fog rolls in. It's hard to explain, but it's unsettling." His admission only deepened my unease. "Do you think there's any truth to the legend? Could the Shadow Walker really be haunting these woods?" Glenn hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the distant bluffs. "I don't know, Danny. I've seen strange things, but I can't say for certain. Just be careful, okay? Avoid the riverbank after dark." I nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and fear. That night, I decided to stay inside my RV, determined to get some rest. But sleep was elusive. The haunted whispers of the Shadow Walker's legend echoed in my mind as I stared at the ceiling, the camera beside me unused. Around 2 a.m, the same scraping noise returned, louder and more deliberate. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and approached the window once again. This time, I saw a faint, glowing figure standing near the back wheel well, a ghostly silhouette with elongated limbs, its face hidden in the shadows. It looked directly at me, its hollow eyes fixed on my soul, before vanishing into the night. I stumbled back inside, breathless and shaken. The fear was paralyzing, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, determined to get to the bottom of this, I returned to the visitor center to speak with Marisol again. She listened intently as I recounted my midnight encounter. "There have been similar reports," she said quietly. "Some say the Shadow Walker is trying to communicate. Others believe it's seeking revenge. Whatever its intent, it's clear it's linked to the disappearances. If you're planning to stay, be vigilant. Don't wander off alone, especially near the river." Her warning hung heavy in the air as I returned to my RV. The day was overcast and the forest seemed quieter than usual. I decided to take some photos along the trails, hoping to capture any unusual activity. As I walked, the tranquility of the woods was interrupted by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Suddenly, a chill wind swept through the trees, carrying an unsettling feeling of being watched. I stopped, heart racing, and scanned the area with my camera. Nothing. Shaking off the feeling, I continued, but the sense of being followed lingered. When I reached a clearing near the riverbank, I saw a figure in the distance, dressed in shadows, moving gracefully among the rocks. My breath caught as I realized it was the Shadow Walker. It looked like a man, yet its form was distorted, elongated, and unnatural. Terrified, I backed away, but the figure advanced with unsettling calmness. It stopped just short of me, its presence overwhelming. "Leave," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The Shadow Walker tilted its head as if studying me, then turned and vanished into the mist once more. Shaken, I hurried back to the RV, finding fresh puncture marks near the water hookup, deeper and more deliberate this time. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize the damage. It was no longer animal activity. I felt a surge of fear and frustration, determined to find answers. That evening, I decided to seek out Caleb Boone, a local hermit rumored to know the forest's secrets. Caleb lived near the forest's edge, in a rundown cabin that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surroundings. When I arrived, he was tending to a small garden, his weathered face breaking into a cautious smile. "Caleb, I need your help," I said, explaining the strange occurrences and the Shadow Walker sightings. Caleb listened intently, nodding slowly. The Shadow Walkers are ancient entities, remnants of a time when the forest was wild and untamed. They feed on fear, confusion, and the disorientation of those who wander too close to their domain. They're not malevolent per se, but they exist in a state of perpetual longing and unrest. I frowned, trying to understand. Is there any way to stop them? Caleb hesitated before speaking. There are old rites, rituals that can appease them or drive them away, but they're not simple. It requires understanding their nature and offering something of value. Most outsiders who try end up becoming lost in the forest themselves. His words echoed in my mind as I left his cabin, feeling more determined yet terrified than ever. I needed to protect myself and uncover the truth behind the Shadow Walkers. That night, I set up additional security measures. More cameras, stronger barricades, and a heavy-duty flashlight by the entrance. As midnight approached, the air grew thick with mist, and the forest seemed to close in around me. The first signs of trouble appeared when my RV's electrical system began to malfunction, lights flickering erratically. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to investigate, only to see the Shadow Walker standing just beyond the perimeter, watching me with its hollow eyes. Panic surged through me as I tried to flee, but the figure moved with unnatural speed, appearing in front of me in an instant. I swung the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it barely fazed the entity. It reached out a shadowy hand, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, my mind clouded with fear and confusion. Desperate, I remembered Caleb's words about the rituals. I decided to make my way to the riverbank, hoping to perform some sort of appeasement. But navigating through the dense forest was disorienting, the mist making everything blur and twist unnaturally. Every step felt like a battle against unseen forces, the whispers of the Shadow Walkers growing louder, taunting me. Finally, I reached the riverbank, heart pounding. The area was eerily quiet, the river's flow masked by the thick fog. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and began to recite the ritual Caleb had shared, a mixture of old chants and symbolic gestures meant to honor the forest and seek peace for the restless entities. As I spoke, the fog thickened, and the temperature dropped. The Shadow Walkers emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering and shifting. They surrounded me, their hollow eyes fixed on my trembling figure. I continued the ritual, pouring out my own fears and regrets, offering respect to the forest and its ancient guardians. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing with blinding light. The Shadow Walkers recoiled, their forms destabilizing under the intense brightness. I felt a surge of hope as they began to fade, their whispers turning into soft sighs. But just as I thought it was over, I saw Glenn Turner emerge from the shadows, his expression grim. "Danny, you need to stop," he said, his voice strained. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Confusion and fear tangled within me. "Glenn, what do you mean? Who are you?" Glenn's eyes hardened. "I've been trying to keep the balance here. The Shadow Walkers are part of the forest's essence. Without them, the natural order is disrupted. You can't interfere." I backed away, realizing the depth of his involvement. "But they're causing harm, making people disappear. There has to be another way." Glenn shook his head, his face contorted with sorrow. "You're not ready to see the true nature of these entities. Leave now, before it's too late." Before I could respond, the shadow walkers surged forward, their forms more solid and menacing. Glenn stepped between us, drawing his service rifle. "Stay back," he commanded, but the entities advanced, driven by a hunger for fear. In the chaos, I realized I had to act quickly. Clutching the heavy flashlight, I aimed it directly at the shadow walkers, forcing the bright light to pierce through their darkness. The entities recoiled, their forms flickering and destabilizing under the intense illumination. With a final surge of energy, they dissipated into the mist, leaving Glenn and me breathless and exhausted. Glenn lowered his rifle, his expression torn between relief and anguish. "I'm sorry, Danny. I didn't want it to come to this." Before I could respond, another shadow walker materialized near the riverbank, its presence more malevolent than before. It lunged toward me, and I swung the flashlight with all my might, the beam catching its face and burning into its essence. The creature let out a shriek, its form destabilizing once more. "Run, Danny! Get back to your RV!" Glenn shouted, pushing me toward safety. I didn't need further encouragement. I sprinted back through the forest, the path now familiar but fraught with unseen dangers. The storm had intensified, rain pouring down and wind howling through the trees. I reached my RV, slamming the door shut and locking it, my body trembling with adrenaline and fear. Inside, I barricaded the doors and windows, catching my breath as the storm raged outside. The RV's interior was a sanctuary from the chaos, but the memory of the shadow walkers and Glenn's desperate pleas lingered in my mind. I knew I couldn't stay here forever, but leaving seemed just as dangerous as staying. Morning light broke through the storm, casting a weak glow over the devastated campsite. I emerged from the RV to assess the damage. My equipment was strewn about, a testament to the night's turmoil. Glenn was nowhere to be seen, and the forest was eerily quiet, the storm's fury subsiding into a gentle drizzle. Determined to leave, I packed up my RV, salvaging what I could. As I drove away, the memories of the night replayed in my mind, each shadow and whisper a reminder of the delicate balance between nature and the supernatural. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow walkers lurking in the mist, but the forest simply stretched out behind me, silent and foreboding. Weeks have passed since that harrowing experience. I've left Shawnee National Forest behind, but the scars remain, both physical and psychological. My photographs from that time tell a story of beauty intertwined with terror, capturing moments where reality and nightmare blur into one. I published the article, complete with my chilling images and the tragic tale of the shadow walkers. The response was mixed, some fascinated, others skeptical. But for me, the truth was clear. I still visit the site occasionally, driven by a mix of professional curiosity and personal connection. I try to capture moments of peace, but the memory of that night remains a shadow over every sunset and sunrise. The legend of the shadow walkers lives on, a reminder that some places hold secrets too ancient and powerful to fully understand or contain. And if you ever find yourself alone at Shawnee National Forest after dark, hearing soft whispers carried by the wind, remember Danny's story. Respect the balance, honor the legends, and tread carefully among the limestone cliffs. Because some shadows aren't just the absence of light, they're the lingering echoes of something ancient, hungry, and restless. My name is Clara Reynolds, and I'm 34 years old. This happened a few weeks ago, during an autumn escape to Cave-in Rock State Park in southern Illinois. After years of covering some of the darkest crimes as a journalist, I found myself emotionally drained and in desperate need of solitude. I bought an old RV, spent weekends renovating it, and embarked on a journey to clear my mind and find inspiration for a true crime book I was writing. Shawnee National Forest, with its dense woodlands and rugged trails, seemed like the perfect place to start. I arrived at a secluded RV campsite near the famous Caven Rock, a limestone marvel with a notorious history of river pirates and unexplained disappearances. The area was almost entirely empty, save for a few other RVs scattered under the towering oaks and maples. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Setting up my RV took a couple of hours, a routine I had become adept at over my travels. Once everything was in place, I stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool, fresh air. The tranquility was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, I decided to take a walk along one of the trails to scout locations for sunrise photography. The path meandered through dense underbrush, leading me to a vantage point that offered a breathtaking view of the river below and the sandstone cliffs rising majestically into the sky. The beauty of the place was humbling, and I felt a rare moment of peace wash over me. Returning to the RV, I noticed Glenn Turner, the park ranger, approaching with a clipboard in hand. He was a tall man, rugged and weathered from years spent outdoors. His skin was unusually pale, almost ghostly against the vibrant backdrop of the forest. "Welcome to Caven Rock, Mr. Reynolds," Glenn greeted, extending his hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes seemed distant, as if he were seeing something beyond my presence. "I hope you enjoy your stay. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thanks, Glenn. I'm really looking forward to capturing some great shots here," I replied, trying to keep the unease from his pale demeanor out of my voice. There was something slightly off about him, but I brushed it aside, assuming it was just the exhaustion of his job. That evening, after setting up my photography equipment, I decided to review the photos I'd taken earlier. The fading light cast eerie shadows across the images, adding a haunting quality to the already dramatic scenery. As I sifted through the shots, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation for the next morning's golden hour. Around midnight, my peace was shattered by a faint scraping noise against the side of the RV. My heart raced as I strained to listen. It sounded like metal against metal, rhythmic and deliberate. Grabbing my flashlight, I approached the window cautiously. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the silhouettes of trees swaying gently in the night breeze. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just a branch brushing against the RV. Still, the sound repeated, each scrape more deliberate than the last. Unable to ignore it, I stepped outside, the cool night air prickling my skin. The moon was full, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam dancing over rocks and foliage. Suddenly, I saw it. A pale, shadowy figure crouched near the water hookup. My breath caught in my throat as the figure lifted its head, revealing hollow, haunting eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Before I could react, the figure vanished into the shadows with unnatural speed, leaving me standing alone in the night. Trembling, I slammed the RV door shut and locked it, my mind racing. Was it a trick of the light, an animal, or something else entirely? The next morning, I found fresh puncture marks on the aluminum siding near the back wheel well. Small, precise holes that looked disturbingly like bite marks. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize the damage. Raccoons? Birds? It didn't add up. I took a few photos for documentation and decided to seek answers. Driving a few miles into the nearby town, I headed straight for the park's visitor center. The building was modest, with maps and brochures neatly arranged on the counters. I met Marisol Green, a local historian who volunteered her time to help visitors. She was in her early 50s, with an elegant demeanor and an air of mystery that seemed to align with the legends she cherished. "I've been hearing some strange things," I began, showing her the photos of the puncture marks. "People have reported missing campers, and there are rumors about a ghostly apparition known as the Shadow Walker. Do you know anything about that?" Marisol nodded, her expression turning somber. "Yes, the legend of the Shadow Walker is well known around here. They say it's an entity that prowls these woods, especially during twilight and heavy fog. It thrives on fear and confusion, preying on those who wander too close to the river or the canyon edges. Some believe it can mimic voices and movements to lure people deeper into the forest." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't a believer in ghosts or legends, but the mounting evidence made me question my skepticism. "Has there been any recent activity, missing persons, strange sightings?" She sighed, leaning against the counter. "There have been a few disappearances over the past few years, all around the same area. The authorities chalk it up to accidents or wildlife, but locals aren't convinced. They keep an eye out and try to avoid the bluffs after dark." Feeling a mix of fear and curiosity, I thanked her and decided to seek out Glenn Turner, hoping he could shed more light on the situation. Back at the campground, Glenn greeted me with the same polite but distant demeanor. "Glenn, I spoke with Marisol Green. Can you tell me more about the Shadow Walker sightings? Have you seen it yourself?" Glenn's eyes flickered briefly to mine before he leaned in, lowering his voice. "I've heard the stories, Clara. Some nights I've seen it near the river, especially when the fog rolls in. It's hard to explain, but it's unsettling." His admission only deepened my unease. "Do you think there's any truth to the legend? Could the Shadow Walker really be haunting these woods?" Glenn hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the distant bluffs. "I don't know, Clara. I've seen strange things, but I can't say for certain. Just be careful, okay? Avoid the riverbank after dark." I nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and fear. That night, I decided to stay inside my RV, determined to get some rest. But sleep was elusive. The haunted whispers of the Shadow Walker's legend echoed in my mind as I stared at the ceiling, the camera beside me unused. Around 2 in the morning, the same scraping noise returned, louder and more deliberate. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and approached the window once again. This time, I saw a faint, glowing figure standing near the back wheel well, a ghostly silhouette with elongated limbs, its face hidden in the shadows. It looked directly at me, its hollow eyes fixed on my soul, before vanishing into the night. I stumbled back inside, breathless and shaken. The fear was paralyzing, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, determined to get to the bottom of this, I returned to the visitor center to speak with Marisol again. She listened intently as I recounted my midnight encounter. "There have been similar reports," she said quietly. "Some say the Shadow Walker is trying to communicate. Others believe it's seeking revenge. Whatever its intent, it's clear it's linked to the disappearances. If you're planning to stay, be vigilant. Don't wander off alone, especially near the river." Her warning hung heavy in the air as I returned to my RV. The day was overcast, and the forest seemed quieter than usual. I decided to take some photos along the trails, hoping to capture any unusual activity. As I walked, the tranquility of the woods was interrupted by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Suddenly, a chill wind swept through the trees, carrying an unsettling feeling of being watched. I stopped, heart racing, and scanned the area with my camera. Nothing. Shaking off the feeling, I continued, but the sense of being followed lingered. When I reached a clearing near the riverbank, I saw a figure in the distance, dressed in shadows, moving gracefully among the rocks. My breath caught as I realized it was the Shadow Walker. It looked like a man, yet its form was distorted, elongated, and unnatural. Terrified, I backed away, but the figure advanced with unsettling calmness. "Leave," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The Shadow Walker tilted its head as if studying me, then turned and vanished into the mist once more. Shaken, I hurried back to the RV, finding fresh puncture marks near the water hookup. Deeper and more deliberate this time. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize the damage. It was no longer animal activity. I felt a surge of fear and frustration, determined to find answers. That evening, I decided to seek out Caleb Boone, a local hermit rumored to know the forest's secrets. Caleb lived near the forest's edge, in a rundown cabin that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surroundings. When I arrived, he was tending to a small garden, his weathered face breaking into a cautious smile. "Caleb, I need your help," I said, explaining the strange occurrences in the Shadow Walker sightings. Caleb listened intently, nodding slowly. The Shadow Walkers are ancient entities, remnants of a time when the forest was wild and untamed. They feed on fear, confusion, and the disorientation of those who wander too close to their domain. They're not malevolent per se, but they exist in a state of perpetual longing and unrest. I frowned, trying to understand. Is there any way to stop them? Caleb hesitated before speaking. There are old rites, rituals that can appease them or drive them away, but they're not simple. It requires understanding their nature and offering something of value. Most outsiders who try end up becoming lost in the forest themselves. His words echoed in my mind as I left his cabin, feeling more determined yet terrified than ever. I needed to protect myself and uncover the truth behind the Shadow Walkers. That night, I set up additional security measures. More cameras, stronger barricades, and a heavy-duty flashlight by the entrance. As midnight approached, the air grew thick with mist, and the forest seemed to close in around me. The first signs of trouble appeared when my RV's electrical system began to malfunction, lights flickering erratically. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to investigate, only to see the Shadow Walker standing just beyond the perimeter, watching me with its hollow eyes. Panic surged through me as I tried to flee, but the figure moved with unnatural speed, appearing in front of me in an instant. I swung the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it barely fazed the entity. It reached out a shadowy hand, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, my mind clouded with fear and confusion. Desperate, I remembered Caleb's words about the rituals. I decided to make my way to the riverbank, hoping to perform some sort of appeasement. But navigating through the dense forest was disorienting, the mist making everything blur and twist unnaturally. Every step felt like a battle against unseen forces, the whispers of the Shadow Walkers growing louder, taunting me. Finally, I reached the riverbank, heart pounding. The area was eerily quiet, the river's flow masked by the thick fog. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and began to recite the ritual Caleb had shared, a mixture of old chants and symbolic gestures meant to honor the forest and seek peace for the restless entities. As I spoke, the fog thickened, and the temperature dropped. The Shadow Walkers emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering and shifting. They surrounded me, their hollow eyes fixed on my trembling figure. I continued the ritual, pouring out my own fears and regrets, offering respect to the forest and its ancient guardians. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing with blinding light. The Shadow Walkers recoiled, their forms destabilizing under the intense brightness. I felt a surge of hope as they began to fade, their whispers turning into soft sighs. But just as I thought it was over, I saw Glenn Turner emerge from the shadows, his expression grave. "Clara, you need to stop," he said, his voice strained. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Confusion and fear tangled within me. "Glenn, what do you mean? Who are you?" Glenn's eyes hardened. "I've been trying to keep the balance here. The Shadow Walkers are part of the forest's essence. Without them, the natural order is disrupted. You can't interfere." I backed away, realizing the depth of his involvement. "But they're causing harm, making people disappear. There has to be another way." Glenn shook his head, his face contorted with sorrow. "You're not ready to see the true nature of these entities. Leave now, before it's too late." Before I could respond, the Shadow Walkers surged forward, their forms more solid and menacing. Glenn stepped between us, drawing his service rifle. "Stay back," he commanded, but the entities advanced, driven by a hunger for fear. In the chaos, I realized I had to act quickly. Clutching the heavy flashlight, I aimed it directly at the Shadow Walkers, forcing the bright light to pierce through their darkness. The entities recoiled, their forms flickering and destabilizing under the intense illumination. With a final surge of energy, they dissipated into the mist, leaving Glenn and me breathless and exhausted. Glenn lowered his rifle, his expression torn between relief and anguish. "I'm sorry, Clara. I didn't want it to come to this." Before I could respond, another Shadow Walker materialized near the riverbank, its presence more malevolent than before. It lunged toward me, and I swung the flashlight with all my might, the beam catching its face and burning into its essence. The creature let out a shriek, its form destabilizing once more. Glenn seized the opportunity to grab me, pulling me away from the river. "We need to get out of here, now!" he shouted, dragging me toward safety. I didn't need further encouragement. I sprinted back through the forest, the path now familiar but fraught with unseen dangers. The storm had intensified, rain pouring down, and wind howling through the trees. I reached my RV, slamming the door shut and locking it, my body trembling with adrenaline and fear. Inside, I barricaded the doors and windows, catching my breath as the storm raged outside. The RV's interior was a sanctuary from the chaos, but the memory of the Shadow Walkers and Glenn's desperate pleas lingered in my mind. I knew I couldn't stay here forever, but leaving seemed just as dangerous as staying. Morning light broke through the storm, casting a weak glow over the devastated campsite. I emerged from the RV to assess the damage. My equipment was strewn about, a testament to the night's turmoil. Glenn was nowhere to be seen, and the forest was eerily quiet, the storm's fury subsiding into a gentle drizzle. Determined to leave, I packed up my RV, salvaging what I could. As I drove away, the memories of the night replayed in my mind, each shadow and whisper a reminder of the delicate balance between nature and the supernatural. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the Shadow Walkers lurking in the mist, but the forest simply stretched out behind me, silent and foreboding. Weeks have passed since that harrowing experience. I've left Cave in Rock State Park behind, but the scars remain, both physical and psychological. My photographs from that time tell a story of beauty intertwined with terror, capturing moments where reality and nightmare blur into one. I published the article, complete with my chilling images and the tragic tale of the Shadow Walkers. The response was mixed. Some found it compelling, others dismissed it as embellished folklore. But for me, the truth was clear. I still visit the site occasionally, driven by a mix of professional curiosity and personal connection. I try to capture moments of peace, but the memory of that night remains a shadow over every sunset and sunrise. The legend of the Shadow Walkers lives on, a reminder that some places hold secrets too ancient and powerful to fully understand or contain. And if you ever find yourself alone at Cave-in Rock State Park after dark, hearing soft whispers carried by the wind, remember Danny's story. Respect the balance, honor the legends, and tread carefully among the limestone cliffs. Because some shadows aren't just the absence of light, they're the lingering echoes of something ancient, hungry, and restless. O1 Mini.